you realize that if you help the most marginalized population, then all populations benefit.
Welcome to the Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Welcome, everyone, all our listeners and all our viewers to the Race to Social Justice podcast series. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm your host, co-host, one of the co-hosts here, Kiva White, and I am the black guy, as you can see.
And I'm John Kepner. I'm the white guy. And Kiva and I share a love for the letter K. K for Kiva, K for Kepner, and K for the knowledge factor. And tonight, K for Kutztown University.
Yes, good stuff. Good stuff. Well, as all of you know, the goal of our podcast is really to promote racial and social equity and justice through honest and even sometimes very difficult dialogue. And we call these conversations courageous conversations. And my dear friend John and I have found our discussions on these topics with each other have deepened over the years. And we have gained a greater respective understanding of racism and our personal responsibilities in that regard on how to address these issues. And that has led us to invite other guests to share their thoughts and their honest experiences in learning around racial justice, racial equity and inclusion. And we hope that these conversations will help our listeners and even those that we invite as to be guests along their personal journey towards making the world a better place. And that's really what these conversations is all about, to get us all comfortable to be able to talk about these issues that are impacting our society today. So John, with that, who are our guests for tonight?
Well, I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Warren Hilton, who is a executive at Kutztown University up near Allentown, and happens to also be the chair of the board of a foundation called HealthSpark Foundation. And also Russ Johnson, who for 20 years now has been the president and CEO of HealthSpark Foundation. And by way of introduction, because we're going to talk a little bit about the foundation, it's a foundation, a so-called conversion foundation. When nonprofit hospitals are sold, as the one in Lansdale near where we live was sold 20 plus years ago, the proceeds are put into a foundation to benefit the community. And in this case, it's about over $40 million endowment that is overseen, and the proceeds every year are donated to the community. And you're going to hear a little bit about what's happening there. I met Russ on the year of my retirement. I'm not going to tell you how many years ago because it's too many, but I kept hearing about this guy, and so I had the time. So I heard he was a neighbor, so we went to breakfast, and that led to his asking me to join HealthSpark as a community member and then a board member. But more importantly, we've become real colleagues. He's been a real great advisor to me. In fact, a lot of what I'm doing, including this podcast, I can trace right back to advice Russ gave me at that first breakfast we had together. So I am greatly indebted to him. And through that, I got involved in HealthSpark and met Warren and have developed a relationship with Warren, not just as a fellow board member, but we have breakfast from time to time. And he's brought me into awareness of some things that he's doing, which has expanded my understanding of racial justice and so forth. So that's my introduction. I could go on, but I guess you want me to start here. So I'm going to start with you, Warren. As we often do with these podcasts, we like to go back to the beginning, to childhood, to your family. Tell us a bit about how you were raised in your family environment, where you grew up and what it was like, and how those experiences may have impacted what you're doing today, particularly in the area of racial and social justice.
Sure. I appreciate that. And thank you to both you, John, and Kiva for having me and Russ here tonight. I'm terribly ecstatic about that. So, if we go back to the beginning, I was born in Philadelphia, born and raised. I joke sometimes and say the only difference between me and Will Smith is when I got in trouble, I didn't have a rich auntie and uncle in California to go to. But I was born in what some people would call a lower middle class neighborhood. My family, it was myself, my brother, my mom and dad. My dad was a blue collar worker. My mother didn't work until I was in probably second grade, as far as I can remember. So we lived off of one income for quite some time. Both of my parents have a high school education. And we lived in, a row home and enjoyed all the pleasures of the city and all the challenges of the city as well. And it has made me who I am today. And I will tell you, my parents instilled in my brother and I that education was the critical factor of how you make something of yourself. And that was the wording that often was used by my parents in the house. If you want to make something of yourself, you have to get a good education. That was taught to me not only by my parents, but others in the neighborhood. My brother and I were both athletes growing up. So my parents instilled in us that if you wanted to play sports, you had to do well in school. So we both did well in school because we wanted to play sports. So we were able to engage with coaches and teachers and other people who also instilled that value in me and my brother, that education was the critical factor for us changing the trajectory of our life. And that's kind of the story of where it all started and why, education is so important to me and why, I do this work in terms of education, social justice, and things of that nature. So, yeah.
So when did you first have an awareness that racial justice was of race in itself as it impacted you?
Yeah, I would say, the interesting part, I told you my dad was a blue collar worker. Where it first came up for me, because I lived in, the neighborhoods in Philadelphia at that time were very segregated. I can tell you at that time, there were probably 4 at most white families in our neighborhood. And there was 1 white family in the school that I went to. But my dad, being a blue collar worker, and at the time, as my mom was not working, ends were not meeting, as they say. So my dad took on a second job, a side hustle, as they would say, as a landscaper. And so he landscaped all of apartment complexes and doctor's offices out on the main line of Philadelphia. And of course, my brother and I were his workers. So on Saturday mornings during the school year, we journeyed out to the main line and we landscaped these properties. And it was an eye-opening experience for me to see how we lived in Philadelphia, and then how folks on the main line lived, who were largely at that time, white. And that was where it became evident to me that something was different between my context and the context of folks who were on the main line. And while we never were mistreated by the individuals that my dad worked for in the main line, it was clear that we were different. And that's where it kind of first hit me. And I would say I might have been all of about 7 or 8 years old when it really hit me.
Wow. I really, every time I hear someone talk about their observation and the first time they can relate to, experiencing some form of racial justice or, racial inequity, I kind of surmise it under this term of optics of oppression. And it's not until we kind of venture out of, like you and your brother ventured out of your neighborhood and to the main line. And that's when your optics kind of change. But up until then, there was some sense of normalcy because that's all you knew in that environment. And it really changes your perspective on life. So I really appreciate you sharing your experience from what Elijah Anderson in his book Code Switching talks about. He talks about, he did an observational study of walking down Germantown Avenue, and he just documented the changes that he saw. And I think that when our optics of oppression hits us, it really sticks with us. And you mentioned 7 years old, so thank you for sharing that, Warren. And Russ, what about you? Same question for you. Where did you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your parents, the values that was instilled in you as a child. And when did your optics of oppression or social injustice, when did that resonate for you? How did that come about?
Probably last week. Certainly late in life. So like Warren, I too was born in Philadelphia at a hospital that no longer exists. But I was raised as the third generation to live and be raised in Cheltenham Township. So my father's mother was raised in Melrose Park, and she and her husband then bought a house in 1930 in Wyncote, the height of the Depression. And that house was 1 block from where my mother's family also lived. So they were raised literally a block apart. Wow. Never liked each other, never were in the same circles. My father went off to the Second World War. He served in the Army. And after returning from the Army, he went to work for what was the family business. And it lasted about 6 or 7 months. And it was my father's mother's family. And she had a brother who was 12 years older than she was. And the brother decided that the family business wasn't big enough for both sides of the family. And so my father was asked to leave. And my father was not college educated, but now, had started a family, had married my mother, and had, built a house in Glenside, which is where I was raised. And so he went to work in the insurance industry and was just a basic guy who learned how to do that work as a salesperson and made a good life for himself. It was a struggle along the way, for sure. Yeah. But he never went to school, and it was sort of a regret, which was really interesting because his father had a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He was a Wharton grad. So education wasn't the same way that Warren described. In his family, my mother was a college graduate. She went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. But there was always that kind of emphasis on being prepared for life because you never know. And here my father thought, he was just going to be in the family business, and that just didn't come to play at a very early point in his life. So raised in Cheltenham, at the time, the public school was about 85-90% Jewish. Population, very, very few people of color. Ironically, I remember the one person of color in my kindergarten class whose last name was White. Well, ironic, right? So a good old Arthur was just a member of the class, and nobody really recognized him as a person of color. He was just a member of the class. And when we did things, he was just there. There was no conscious inclusion, exclusion. He was just there. I went on to college at Muhlenberg in Allentown, and then later on went to get my degree in social work at the University of Pennsylvania. And in those days, there was a mandatory course that all students had to take, and it was called institutional racism. It was team taught by a professor, two professors, one of whom was white, one of whom was black. That was intentional. There were four classes. Each one of them had a different pair. And having been raised in a near all white community, it was a very interesting exposure to institutionalized racism. And the tenor of the first year course was all about how white people had created this terrible environment for people of color. And it was our responsibility. And there was a lot of blame and finger pointing in those classes. It was an ugly 2 semesters at Penn.
Wow.
The second year, it flipped. The conversation, again, run by an African-American professor and a white counterpart, really started to look at solutions. And that was sort of the beginning of building awareness. So Lou Carter was the African-American faculty person in the second year. I still remember him to this day when he said to me, Russ, you've earned your degree. You're going to go out and practice. And he says, but make no mistake. He said, your degree only means that you've earned the right to start learning. And I thought,
I like that.
Oh, I just worked really hard and I just got this degree and it cost me a lot of money. And, now I'm just starting. But that was the beginning. I was had my field placement for those 2 years in a public child welfare agency in Bucks County. Again, a pretty white community. The disadvantaged populations were almost entirely white, and a subset of that was the military, because there were 2 military active stations, one in Johnsville, one in Willow Grove. And interestingly, there was a lot of child abuse that took place in those installations. But I started to build my career in public child welfare. I was there for about 17 years altogether. Wow. Got hired, and so my background is very eclectic. I left government service, went to work for a small entrepreneurial startup company, left there, went to work for the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'll hook back with that story later, but did some consulting, worked for a large multinational insurance company, actually 2 of them, and then ultimately came to HealthSpark. So it's been an interesting time, lots of opportunities to meet people. Growing up as a kid, I was one of those folks who tended to not be involved in sports, except I was in the marching band. So, that was the way to get involved with sports.
Right.
But I was on the newspaper in high school, again in college, lots of music and theater and those kinds of things preoccupied, leisure time. Yeah. And the other thing about my growing up was that my parents were pretty comfortable in retrospect to others. So we had a second home. And the day after school let out in Cheltenham, we left and we went to the Poconos, and we didn't come home till the day before school started. So I had a whole second group of friends. And those folks were from New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and Ohio and Maryland. They were all had one thing in common. They were all members of the Lutheran Church. And so faith in those days, had a centering perspective, but we were all white people, and we were all kind of living together, somewhat isolated from the rest of the world and its realities. And my social work job was the only thing that kind of pulled me out.
Yeah, I was gonna circle back to that for a look, because I see there's something that we have in common. I'm also a social worker, And I understand you got your MSW from Temple. I'm a Temple owl too.
No, I'm Penn.
Oh, Penn, right? Yep, Penn. I'm sorry. And you have your MSW, right? So if you think about the work that social workers are involved in, particularly child welfare, I can only imagine some of the injustices that you saw working in that arena. Could you share with us a time where you were presented with some type of social injustice, and what was that like for you? How did your education as a social worker prepare you for that moment?
I wish I could tell you that the injustices were recognized when they were happening, but they really weren't. As I said, I was there for 17 years. I, in the course of that time, was involved with more than 150 adoptions.
Wow.
And in order to have an adoption, you either have a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, or you involuntarily go to court and terminate people's rights against their will. I litigated over 100 of those cases.
Wow.
And at the time, it was thought that these kids would be far better off in a nurturing home than they would be living with parents who were abusive, who were suffering from chronic alcoholism and drug addiction and other kinds of plights like that. I got pretty active in the adoption community, and one of the first things that we did was start advocating for the rights of African-American children to be adopted by African-American parents. Mm-hmm. And the parents didn't have to be the traditional couple. Mm-hmm. So that was my first, let's get out there a little bit. Let's think a little bit differently. Let's think about culture. Let's think about heritage. Let's think about customs and the like. So that was maybe one of my first areas where I started to get a little bit more aware of the implications of my work. But I have to say that it was years later, after I left the field, that looking back, the laws, the procedures that took place in the court hearings, the way in which the judges managed the hearings were terribly traumatizing. And child welfare and child abuse in itself is traumatizing. But when you just add more to it, and you actually separate children from their birth families, it's a lifelong injury. And I started to talk about that in my work and say, let's just think about what we do and the implications. It seems right at the moment, but can we at least ask ourselves what the alternative might be? And so those were some of the early beginnings of kind of looking at social justice issues.
Yeah. So I thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. I know that the research on racial matching, particularly in child welfare, is evident that when children are matched in homes where the culture resembles their racial background, their cultural background, the placement tends to last longer. So I want to just put that out there, and it's good that you advocated for that, because the research really supports that notion of racial matching when it comes to out-of-home placements.
So I think that's a natural segue to a question or a discussion with Warren. One of the things I didn't know about Warren when I first met him, but came to know after we got together and compared notes and so forth, is his strong interest in not only education, but also another aspect of our system with handling children, those that have been through the
foster care system.
Foster care, and so tell us how you got interested in that area, and what you've done at Kutztown and are planning to do at Kutztown in that regard with the students there.
Yeah. So, through, I talked about my experience going out to the main line and how that, kind of was my first exposure. And, after that time, it was not like I looked for these things, but, things just kept happening, right? Where you realize, like, wait a minute, something's different here, right? Like, wait a minute, that just happened and it didn't feel right. I'm not 100% sure as a kid why. And all throughout my life, that kind of continued to happen. And I've kind of developed a philosophy that if you help the most marginalized population, then all populations benefit, right? And so when I got here to Kutztown University, I met a gentleman who runs 8 social service agencies, one of which is an organization called Child Promise. And we got together and started talking about this concept of helping marginalized students succeed and what that would do for all of our populations here at the university. And through the generosity of Child Promise, we started a program for foster care youth here at Kutztown University. The statistics are staggering when it comes to foster care youth in college. 70% of foster care youth desire to go to college. There's no, I would say, nationally normed statistic, but there's different statistics. So on average, only 11% or less actually go to college. And then we know that out of them, less than 50%, and actually there's some numbers that suggest less than 25% of the ones that go to college actually complete their degree. So through that, we got together and crafted this program called Providing Resources and Opportunities for Future Standouts, or PROFs as we call it, that turns those statistics on their head. So we started with 9 students in 2017. 6 of those 9 students have graduated. 3 of those initial cohort of 9 are in graduate school right now. So we're changing that paradigm, and we're doing it by applying the principles of social justice, right? So making sure that we have an equity mindset, that these students, some of whom have attended 12 different schools during their K through 12 education. I had one young person in the program who had been in 5 different high schools, right? So, and all the trauma that you talked about from the court system earlier, all of that, they come to our university with that. And so we apply principles of social justice to say, and equity to say, what do they need that maybe another student does not? And we give that to them. So we give them weekly coaching sessions. We give them mandatory workshops around time management and things of that nature, because when you're in the system, right, the system does everything for you. Everything's there for you, and they transport you at a certain time to your appointments and things of that nature. So, and then of course we're dealing with social justice from a homeless perspective, right? These are students, if they come to us out of the foster care system, they're out of the foster care system. So when we have break, summer break, winter break, they do not have anywhere to go. So we make sure that they're housed here on campus over breaks. We give them some financial resources to support them over those breaks. And then we kind of fill in the gap as much as we can where parents would. So, you go home for spring break, in my case, mom cooked my favorite meal, that type of stuff. They took me out to, one of my favorite restaurants. And so we do that for our students, right? So we will take them out to a restaurant over break, or we'll take them on an overnight trip to the beach or to DC or somewhere that they want to experience. And again, we've grown that program to 30 students, and those students are now being successful, graduating, as I said, and some are actually going on to grad school, some are in gainful employment. And if you talk to the students, much like I said earlier about my home life and what my parents said to me about education, changing the trajectory of my life. When you talk to these students and when they graduate and they are gainfully employed or in graduate school, they say the same exact thing. Wow, I did not know that education would do all of this for me. Where would I be without Kutztown University getting me a college degree and this program supporting me when I did not have the support? So that's kind of that story. And I'm thankful for the generosity of Child Promise. And has local connections to Montgomery County with folks like Dr. Charles Kwan and Pastor Charles Kwan, I should say, and Dr. Nathaniel Williams.
Wow.
So one follow-up, Kiva, before
Yeah.
you, this Dr. Nathaniel Williams, who is the CEO of Child Promise that Warren mentioned, is also now a member of our board at HealthSpark. And Russ told me a story. I want you to relate the story, Russ. I'll tee it up for you. When you met Dr. Williams along with Dr. Hilton, you asked a question about why Dr. Hilton kept referring to his good friend, Dr. Williams, as opposed to Nate or Nathaniel. You want to tell that story? Because, and what you gleaned from that?
Yeah, it's a simple, quick story, but I think it goes to the roots of what Warren was sharing earlier, that education was presented to him as an opportunity and one where he worked very hard and through a lot of sacrifice earned a degree and went on and earned a terminal degree. He's Dr. Warren Hilton. And similarly, Dr. Williams, who shared with me that he is a product of the foster care system himself, is somebody who I think learned at an early age that education was a path forward and out. And he's an academic addict. In the sense that he has so many degrees that there's not enough letters in the alphabet.
We have to call him Doctor.
Doctor. Yeah. And in fact, when I was asking him about HealthSpark board service, I, was intrusive enough to ask the pointed question. So you're pursuing another doctorate, and I believe it's at UCLA. Do you have enough time to devote to being a good board member at HealthSpark? And he says, I just will make the time. And I said, oh, okay. But I think that especially within the African-American community, there is a level of respect that's afforded to somebody to acknowledge the hard work that they've put into earning a place in the community that is kind of that normalized, you made it kind of thing. So if you carry the title of doctor, there's a certain social status that's afforded to you. And so that's what I learned in terms of that quick story, which I guess I made way too long, but.
And if I may, I'll just build upon that. It is exactly what Russ said, that respect, but also it is about the next generation and generation. So when, I'm with Dr. Williams and he's on campus or we're somewhere and there's other students around and they hear Dr. Williams, that engenders to them. I just told you, we have several of our students who the statistics are daunting, even getting a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, that are now in grad school. So when they hear Dr. Williams or Dr. Hilton, that signals to them, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Wait a minute, I can do more than just a bachelor's degree. That was my original dream, but if I wanted more, I now know that I could do that. Especially in Dr. Williams's case, being a product of the foster care system, and being able to, go to college, get the degrees and the multiple doctorates,
Wow.
that signals to that next generation that it is a possibility for me. So while it is
Mm.
respect for me, when I say Dr. Williams, it's certainly respect for him and his hard work. We both know that it's also about the others around us who may be listening,
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, now I realize that's something that
Mhm.
I can do."
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you shared that backstory on that, Warren, because I think you're right. I think most kids, I work with kids, African American kids in the urban community for a very long time. And when you think about the term doctor, most of them are thinking medical doctor. and that's most of the time that when they hear that term, it's someone that may not actually look like them from a racial standpoint. So I think you're right. I think just modeling it and letting them hear it, so they're hearing and seeing the potential in terms of who they can become and what they can accomplish when they stay dedicated to their academic pursuits. So I really like the fact that you mentioned that you also they see you, but they also hear you, humbly respect the other gentleman for his accomplishments, and that's just a really powerful tool of empowerment for our young people. So I thank you for sharing that. It's awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Go
go ahead,
ahead.
John.
No,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Russ, John tells me that you've been at HealthSpark for quite some time, and I wanted to just ask you to share a little bit about how did you get there. I know you shared a little bit about your eclectic experiences in different arenas of focus, but how did you wind up at HealthSpark, and what has kept you there over the years? And then when you think about the topic of racial and social justice, why is that subject so compelling to you personally?
So the short story about how I got to HealthSpark is a story of networks and privilege.
Mm.
So I had the opportunity to work at the Pew Charitable Trusts. I was a national program officer in their largest division at the time, which was Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
And so, if you will, I had that pedigree of somebody who understood foundation and philanthropic work.
Right.
As John said, when hospitals were sold, oftentimes the solution to what to do with the proceeds was to create a foundation. And in the North Penn area, there were a few board members who decided that they wanted to be on the board of that foundation, but none of them knew what foundations, how they worked and what they did. So they went out. One of the board members had a daughter who was a recruiting executive recruiter, and
Yeah.
she happened to call a colleague of mine who said, "Oh, you need to talk to Russ. He fills all your check marks. He has foundation experience. He lives in the community. Um, he's a social worker. He understands health and human services." And so the rest is, kind of the history of being hired. Um, so that's how I came to HealthSpark. The opportunity to work in philanthropy is just an amazing privilege. And not only do you have the opportunity to meet a myriad of really thoughtful, hardworking people, but you have the opportunity to learn so much about people, about systems, about organizations, about movements and the like. And so HealthSpark has afforded me the opportunity to participate in a large variety of national forums, to work with my colleagues in philanthropy and learn about different things over a period of time. So in the early years, it was, the excitement of building something, of beginning to see some return on the investment of trying to partner in the community and do something that made somebody's life better. Which again, that's that's what drew me to social work in the first place. And even though my track in social work was always about administration and not treatment, the motivation was still there, like make something better. So around the end of the first 10 years is really when racial equity and social justice started to come into the forefront. And there were a number of things that were happening at HealthSpark at that time. The original founding board members were all gone. I had the opportunity to build an entirely new board. And that board was beginning to be a little bit more diversified, which wasn't a big challenge since I think we had one person of color on the board when I was hired. But with that also came a deeper understanding of the dynamics in the community, and some real, true, meaningful relationships were at that point, after 10 years, starting to congeal. I'd always made a point of doing nothing that was going to not be embraced by local county government, because I recognized at the end of the day that the safety net system that we focus our investing in is predominantly supported by local county government taxpayers' dollars, right? And by the contracts that local county government makes with these providers. And so, I could have had a great idea, but if the county wasn't going to buy into it, it was a waste of our money. And it was a waste of the effort and time. So building those partnerships was something else that was pretty exciting. And again, you got to meet new people and bring new ideas. So hearkening back to the days of Pew, that my boss there said, never accept anything on face value. Just because that's the way it's done today doesn't mean that's the way it has to be. People get ingrained. And if you don't, one of your roles is to ask questions. And so I brought that into my job at HealthSpark, and I started to ask a lot of questions. Sometimes in retrospect, I guess I wasn't as respectful as I should have been in asking those questions. Maybe I had a little edge to them, or a little bit of attitude, or like whatever.
You were passionately presenting your point of view.
Arguing a point of view, yeah. But it was always with the best of intentions. And, I made a lot of friendships, and I was able to build a lot of synergy. And one of those absolutely quintessential moments was when I met with a leader in the county government who had been there for a really long time. And I said to her, we're in the midst of a worldwide financial crisis. And the number of people who are experiencing homelessness here in Montgomery County is growing. And yet your department isn't serving anybody new. And the waiting lists are getting longer and longer. The provider community isn't getting any money to expand programs or services. In fact, they don't even want to discharge the people that they have to make room for new people. And I said, the system seems a little broken. Like, what's this all about? And I guess if I had asked those questions or had those conversations with some people, nothing would have ever happened. But this woman said to me, I have an MBA. I've been here for a really long time. I want to go out with a bang. So what do you have in mind? And I said, let's shake the tree and see if we can figure out how to serve more people with the same amount of money. Let's ask our providers if they can reimagine what they would do with the folks that they serve. Yeah. It was a 4-year effort before it actually came together. HealthSpark invested in a bunch of piloting and research and small scale stuff to just get more and more and more buy-in. But one of the early aha moments that really kind of came from all of this work was the realization that the people who were being served in Montgomery County's housing and homeless system were people of color. And almost without exception, the people who were providing the services came from mainstream faith organizations who employed white people as their employees and leaders.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions was, well, why can't we get people in and why can't we get people out? Started to take on a different context. Maybe we're not listening to what people really need, because it seemed like we had a pretty good system. It was a comprehensive set of services. And in the early days, it was sort of like, okay, if you're homeless, when we can find a bed for you, we'll bring you in. But we really didn't figure out what we did with you until that point. And then after we had you go through the shelter program, we would send you to the transitional housing program, where you would stay for 2 years.
Wow.
And if you could get your act together, then we would graduate you out of the transitional housing program, because by that time you would have learned how to manage your life and you wouldn't be homeless.
Wow.
Now, I'm on purpose using a bit of hyperbole here, and I don't mean to convey any disrespect for all the people who were working in that day and age, but that's really what the system was.
Yeah.
And so it was a 30-day shelter system, and most people were in shelter for 120 days or more. It was a 2-year maximum time in transitional housing, and most people were there for 3 or 4 or 5 years. We had one person who was there for 10.
Wow.
And so we were doing for people, as Warren was saying a few minutes ago about the foster care system. The system did everything for you.
Yeah.
Right? We weren't helping people to self-actualize and tell us what they wanted in their lives. We were telling them what they should want.
Yeah.
And what they needed to do in order to be offered assistance.
Wow. I'm familiar. I'm somewhat familiar with the homeless system in Pennsylvania, more specifically Philadelphia. I did some training consulting work with some of the homeless service providers in the city. And I think there's been some progress in this with some of the federal regulations and changes through HUD, the Housing and Urban Development. And I mean, Russ, you're probably familiar with the whole rapid rehousing program, moving people into, and now they're really the stay in shelters is short. It's 30 days, and they're skipping the transitional phase and getting folks into permanent supportive housing now.
Rapid rehousing,
because just like you said, the research and all of that's just really it's kind of like parentified programming, if you so to speak, and
so
it doesn't help.
Me at HealthSpark. So I said to my board, this system's broken, guys.
Yeah.
And we focus the majority of our resources right here in Montgomery County. And what I need is to do a national scan of best practice, and then find out what we can import here to make our system different. My board of directors by that time gave me that runway to do that kind of work. And so we hired a California-based research firm to deliver to us what was going on nationally as best practices.
Yeah.
And we looked at Norfolk, Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, and Alameda County, California. The community felt that the California-based program was the most replicable to Montgomery County. So my board gave me money, and I took a cohort of people for 1 week and went to California.
Wow.
To learn from the folks out there what it is that they did and how they did it and how they built a groundswell of support in the provider community and the funder community and the government and at the national level. And the long and the short of it is, Kiva, that we brought back the best of what we found in California. We played around and tinkered with it. And a couple of years later, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania was acknowledged by the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development as one of the leading communities in the country.
Wow.
Leading housing transformation. What a privilege that my board gave to me and to our community to be able to do that work.
That's
We
awesome.
have similarly done system transformation work in food security.
Right.
A whole different story, a whole nother day.
Yeah.
But that's what keeps me at HealthSpark.
Well, you're definitely a change agent. I tell you, just hearing, because that's what it is. I mean, most of the time when you hear these inequities, it's mostly embedded in the system, the design of the system. And so when you're able to take a look at that system and make those changes to make it more equitable or equal in terms of access and affordability, or just changing a person's life trajectory, that's where it takes solid leadership. And I really appreciate you sharing that story and leading the charge to really reform that system, because if the system doesn't change, the service delivery will remain the same and people will stay stagnated in their growth. So
and government pays for performance, right?
Correct. Yeah, performance-based.
The contract, what hoops you need to go through.
Yes.
So Montgomery County, when we first started this, was one of the top 10 rated communities in the entire country by HUD.
Wow.
And the reason that it was rated so high is because we completed all of our reports accurately and on time.
Right. Didn't go to the.
That's what HUD cared about in those days.
Yeah.
They didn't care about people moving in and out of the system.
Yeah.
So
outputs versus outcomes. We could go all day about this, but that's awesome. Go ahead, John.
There are many other examples of HealthSpark's approach under this leadership to do system change.
Yeah.
But I'd like to focus on one aspect of that is evolving as we speak. I'm going to take us back, the three of us, not you, Kiva, you weren't there, but a governance committee meeting maybe 4 years ago now, where we started addressing our mission and vision and as it related to social and racial justice. And, where Russ got all this information from all around the country, what other organizations were doing, and we all looked at that and we boiled it down to a sentence or two in our mission. And I'll never forget this because it's really influenced me. We were talking about what would be our organizational commitment and how we would characterize that and then hold it out to the community. And but we also looked at what would be our personal responsibility. It's easy to hide behind the organization, but what did we as individuals, how do we could buy all this, but what do we need to do? And we put that into the mission statement. For me, it was an extremely powerful moment. I think the three of us were all there. I see you nodding, Warren. And this was before the events of 2 summers ago, when this became awareness, much broader awareness. But it was a start for me anyway of a journey that has now led to I think a very transformative set of things that we're doing. And Warren, could you profile some of those things, particularly the Black Justice Fund that is and how that's evolving?
Yeah, and Russ, jump in, please. I applaud Russ, and I know Russ gives the board a lot of credit, but I must say I applaud Russ taking these steps. When Russ and I met, we had a conversation about some of the work that I was doing and how we did it. And we had this conversation about, we're always going to be on this journey of doing the work around social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, how do we make that a part of our DNA, right? And Russ really bought into that and really saw that when we had that conversation. So that's a part of who we are at HealthSpark, right? We take those risks. It's about, our organizational commitment and our personal commitment. And that has played out in a number of ways. our long-term commitment to the safety net system in the county, making sure that safety net system is shored up, doing it based upon, data and research and best practices, in a way that honors the folks that are being served by the safety net, right? And doing it in a collaborative way. So when we have our communities of practice, we bring all of, is anybody who wants to be there from the safety net system together. We don't set the agenda, right? They set the agenda. Kind of going back to what Russ was saying about asking the people who are doing the work, asking the people who you're serving what it is that is needed. And that's made all the difference in the work that we have done at HealthSpark. And I think it has gained us even more credibility in the community, because they know when they see HealthSpark coming, that it is not HealthSpark coming to tell the community what you need. It is HealthSpark coming to say, we want to be a part of a solution that the community is creating. And a part of that with the Frank E. Boston Black Justice Fund has grown out of that, where we are now saying, how can we invest and support community-based organizations, entrepreneurs, et cetera, who some people might call them social entrepreneurs, but whatever the term would be, how do we support those organizations that are led by Black individuals, right? Frankie Boston was a physician who was very instrumental in starting the local hospital that, as we pointed out earlier, when the nonprofit was sold, that we became established. And so, those are the type of things that we do at HealthSpark, taking those healthy risks so that the community benefits. And it has become ingrained in our DNA. Social justice is ingrained in our DNA. So it was no surprise to me, John, when that conversation at the governance committee happened and we started talking about, well, that's great. We're saying this is about the organization, but what are we as the, board members personally going to commit to doing, right? Because that makes all the difference in the world. So there's many more examples that we could probably give you of the ways that HealthSpark has kind of had that methodology, if you will, in terms of not only organizational, but personal commitment, but doing in a way that honors the community.
Yeah, and that's translated into other things, how we invest our money, how we leverage our money for social justice. It's embedded the entire organization, and I believe it's going to pay great dividends for the community, because they'll observe what we're doing, and it'll translate into other nonprofits that we work with and support, and it'll have a ripple effect. It'll have really a ripple effect throughout the county. So I wanted to also go back to this subject of education.
Yeah.
And I can't help but ask about critical race theory. I mean, it's coming up. It came up in the confirmation hearings. As an educator, as someone who is well educated, Russ, but as an educator, Warren, how do you view that and the implications of it for our country? And could you just dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, it certainly is a difficult conversation that's being had about critical race theory. And I would say no matter how you feel about it, in education, in particular higher education, that's what we're all about, right? We are about looking at theories, looking at history, looking at whatever it is, no matter what field you are, and having that opportunity to critically think about it, formulate your thoughts about what you've analyzed, and communicate that in a way that is respectful to whoever you're communicating with and around. And I think for me, the conversation is not so much about critical race theory. It's about whether or not I see the other person that I'm talking to as a human being, right? There's all kinds of theories that are out there. And, as far as, when the first theory was ever created, right, somebody I'm sure disagreed with it. So it's not about, for me, whether you agree or disagree with critical race theory. It's whether or not we can have a conversation about it in a way where I can see you as a human being, you can see me as a human being, and I can respect the humanity in you, and you can respect the humanity in me, and we can have that conversation. Now, whether we agree or not at the end of that conversation is a totally different story, and we don't have to always agree, right, at the end of the story. But for me, when you talk about education, that's what we're all about, right? We are about having these conversations, analyzing things, doing the research on things, then having the dialogue around those things, and formulating new ideas and more theories and things of that nature. So, it really, for me, the difficulty I see about what the conversations, those extreme conversations about critical race theory, I don't ask the question, why does somebody not like it or like it? I ask the question, can we talk about it in a way that we can respect each other at the end of the day? And just like anything else, right? Just like when I was a kid and I went outside to play and me and my best friend disagreed with something, at the end of the day, we still were best friends, right? So at the end of the day, if whoever's talking about critical race theory, can we still be human beings and recognize each other at the end of the day, and be human beings? And so that's kind of more important to me, whether somebody agrees with critical race theory or not. It's really the difficulty that I see around it is kind of the polarizing conversations that are having. Well, it's not even conversations, right? It's people talking at each other. It's not a dialogue. So that's what it is, in my mind, right?
How about you, Russ? What's your reaction?
I think it's really an interesting question, John, and thank you for bringing it up. Probably is no surprise to have social workers think about starting where people are, on a personal level. And when we look at community organizing, we recognize that the community is only as strong as the composition of everybody who's in the community. And so I find CRT, or critical race theory, to be a divisive term that doesn't help me with my work. I prefer to talk about making a personal connection, respecting somebody's lived experience and the context in which it's playing itself out, and trying to figure out ways in which community can be embraced so that all boats float to a higher level. Okay, so as every family, as every individual can thrive in a community. And I think that's what Warren was just saying. See everyone as a person. See as everyone, who brings, heritage and culture and language and food, to the table. That when we can respect that and enjoy it, and learn how to enjoy it, I think that's when communities are, more cohesive, where they come together, where the quality of life is much, much better. So I think that my professors at Penn would love my answer, because it's all about social work principle.
It's funny, as I think about, those are interesting perspectives. When I hear the term, I think about academic freedom and lifelong learning, and anything that promotes learning, to me, is a good thing. And learning is about, some learning's hard. It's hard to go back and look at our history. If you're a white person, it's hard to go back and look at the history. I'm reading Caste, the book Caste, right now, and it's really hard to read, but I'm learning things and why someone would not want to learn is there's just some people, I guess places our society, some people just have too many barriers, too many built-in barriers that they can't break through. But that's and I'm really concerned about it because it is a red herring too. I think the term has now had its own meaning politically and everything else, which is unfortunate, just like some other terms that are bandied about. But Kiva,
And I think
what's your view?
if I may, I think
Yeah,
Russ
sure.
hit on something that's critical: meeting with people where they are. You know, you're not going to change somebody's mind, right, by pounding them over the head with something, right? Meet them where they are. I will tell you, that is me in a nutshell. I don't care what your background is, race, sexual orientation, religion, anything like that. I want to get to know you and develop a relationship with you as an individual and as a human being. And then we can talk about all these things. And my eyes are often open to things when I can go into a conversation, just meeting that person where they are. So to your point, John, the learning happens not around whether we agree or disagree. It's just, hey, I want to see you as a human being, and tell me how you feel about this, and I'll tell you how I feel about it, and let's talk about why you feel about that. Like, let's talk about why I feel about it, and let's have this conversation, because at the end of the day, what I think, whether you agree or disagree with critical race theory, everybody wants to be acknowledged as a human being, and at its basic core, right, we all want to be able to live whatever our definition of successful lives are.
You're making me want to ask a question, if that's allowed in this format.
Absolutely, yeah.
Through the Black Justice Fund, we pulled together leaders from the African American community to help inform what this fund should be, how it should be marketed, what its goals might be in its early years, and similar types of questions. And one of the things that they recommended, and which has been incorporated into the initial round of grant making, is the value of storytelling. And I've learned over the years that, that is a fundamental component in the African American community for a variety of different reasons, which are not important so much tonight to call out, but just that I think that what Warren was just saying is that if you get to know somebody, and the way you do that is through storytelling, just like we're doing tonight. Where was I born? Who were my parents? Like, what did I do? There's stories, and they build a persona that someone can connect with or wants to not connect with, right? And the real opportunity is to help people tell their stories in ways that engage people, and, if you will, promote that learning moment. But it's not marketed as education or learning. It's more about relationship building and neighborliness and collaboration and partnering in the business community, and all of those kinds of operationalizing kind of verbs that I think are the fundamental building blocks of healing in a community. So we're hoping that we received 37 applications. I've read them all as of this afternoon. There are several that are hoping to get funded to advance storytelling. And they have a variety of strategies and a variety of groups that they're hoping storytelling work will be advanced. Women and girls, returning citizens, elderly people, intergenerational folk, people who are in recovery. Their stories are important to tell too. And so that's what I think might be an ingredient in advancing the cohesiveness and the pulling the very polarized community back together. I wish it would happen quickly. I think it's going to be a long time in coming, but I think when those stories will help people understand each other, as Warren was just sharing.
Well, we are coming near the end of our allotted time.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask both of you in this area of racial and social justice, who is your role model? Who would be, who do you admire? It could be a person none of us know. It could be a public figure. Who comes to mind, top of mind? Warren?
Wow. I will go back to my parents. And I know that sometimes sounds cliche, but I really will. I didn't, when you asked me born and raised, I didn't go into their background very much, how they were born and raised. Both of them were born and raised in Jim Crow South. And, my mother's family could never own land. My dad's family did own land, but it was kind of an impoverished situation. And they faced a lot of racial racism, racial discrimination, a lot of those things. Even to the point, and I learned this when I was actually a teenager. I never met my dad's father because they told me he died when my dad was very young. I learned in my teenage years that he was actually the equivalent of what people might call murdered. He was ran off the road and ended up through all of the segregated principles in the South at that time could have been saved, mended up, surgery and so forth. But all of the things that happened along the way, from the ambulance coming, taking him to the hospital, and you had to take him to this hospital and not that hospital, and then where's his insurance card and all of that. So to know, and quite frankly, the person who did it, never was, prosecuted or anything happened to them, and stayed in the community. And my dad lived in that community, knew this person. And both my mother and my father never taught my brother and I to hate anybody, right? They easily could have took their experiences and said, these are people that treated us this way. You should really hate them. They never taught us that. They taught us to love all people, including people that despitefully used you. And that, to me, as I, kind of matured in my 20s, you don't realize it when you're a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or 15-year-old or, even an 18-year-old. But when you get out on your own, it for me was very impactful to know that these are people who went through such traumatic experiences, and they never taught my brother and I to hate anybody. And I think it is the reason why today that I have, friends and great colleagues from all across the spectrum, right? All races, all religions, all socioeconomic statuses, all political views. And I really admire them for that. And I would not be the person that I am today if it was not for them. So I look up to them and admire them for their stance on, how they viewed racism and how to respond to social injustice. So,
wow.
Russ, how about you? That's great. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you
Thank you
for
for
that.
that. Yeah. What about you,
But
Russ?
I wish I had the deep history story that Warren just shared. But I don't think that the inspiration for the work that I do really came from family. I think it's really come from my professional life. And uh, Warren knows one of the people in my life that we enjoy together, and that's Dr. Marla Gold. Um, Marla is an infectious disease doc by training, but has a public health um, core to her, and her life that she leads and the work that she directs in a myriad of different ways really kind of began to help me understand the value that different folk and different communities really contribute to the mosaic of community. And then once again, HealthSpark gave me an opportunity to participate in the National Racial Equity Learning Collaborative, which was about 25 of us from across the country. I was the only CEO in the group. I was the only person from the Mid-Atlantic region in this group. But I got a chance to meet a couple of people through that experience, which is now almost 5 years ago. So one of the fellows that I met is now the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. His name is Marcus Walton. He's a pretty interesting guy. You can Google him and listen to him. He's
I've
just
heard him speak.
and then I think both Warren, you and John happened to meet Amanda Andre, who is the executive director of Funders to End Homelessness. And HealthSpark invited her to come to our community and talk with one of our communities of practice that I think you both attended.
Mm-hmm.
She is a person with lived experience. She is a strong advocate for racial and social justice work. And she lives it personally as well as professionally. She was one of the first persons that I ever really kind of got to know beyond just a professional relationship, because these learning communities, we would go off to some not very exotic places. I think we went to Milwaukee and we went to, I don't know, Chicago or whatever, but we were never in really like fine, lovely places that most foundation places take you to. But sitting at a bar with her, sitting next to her for dinner, doing some of the exercises together that learning collaborative provided to us, gave me an opportunity to really see how her life influenced her work.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that in action was just inspiring. And I carry it with me all the time. We don't talk often, but we do exchange emails from time to time. Every once in a while, there's a quick phone call or whatever. But those are the folks who I think have really kind of driven in the last several years the work that I do, and why I think that this work is so important to pursue.
Good.
Wow. That's awesome. So, we this podcast is really a platform kind of like for us to discuss these issues. And for me, it's really a platform of hope. Like, I hope that when people listen to this, then, there's some transformation in their thinking and their behavior, just in terms of wanting to make the world a better place, wanting to be able to share their personal story, because I agree that we learn through storytelling, and we all have a story to tell regardless of our diverse social identities, but we all have a story to tell. And I'm hopeful every time I speak to someone, and I'm kind of like what Warren, I was raised in a Christian background, and I was taught like love is like the platform of all engagement, regardless of how you're treated. You're supposed to quote unquote love thy neighbor, and that my grandmother really instilled that in me. And I think over the years, as I grew older and was exposed to difference, which I think is a critical piece to raise one awareness, is just exposure to different people, different neighborhoods, different foods, different, social settings, to be able to learn and always put yourself in a teachable moment to learn about yourself as well as others and their experiences. So I'm hopeful. So I wanted to, hopeful that these podcasts is doing great work. And we shared earlier that we had an officer on the previous podcast, Eric Doherty. He was elevated, his position was elevated to chief diversity officer for his police department, which I think is a huge thing, particularly in the climate that we're in today. So I wanted to close by asking the two of you is like, what do you hope, in terms of the problems that are faced in our society today? What's your hope for achieving social and racial equity and justice? What do you look to see change within the coming years or decades to come? And Russ, let's start with you.
I alluded to it a minute ago. My hope is the polarization that exists in this country at the moment begins to fade away, and that there is more an understanding about the value of diversity, the contributions that people make to communities, to their congregations, if you will, they're faith-oriented, to their businesses, to their social clubs, whatever. We've just become so polarized and friendships have been fractured. And I'm just looking for better times.
Better times.
Which I think come through a more amicable understanding about the value of humanity.
Wow. Thank you for that. Warren, what about you, sir?
Yeah, I think my hope is going back to what I said earlier, that we can develop spaces and create space where we can have the dialogue, see each other as human beings. And if we disagree at the end of the day, you know what? We're still a part of, whatever it is. We're still a part of HealthSpark. If we disagree on our board, if you disagree in your family, you're still a part of that family. You're still loved. There's still a place for you. And I think if we can model that and replicate that, then I think that's my hope, that will create a society that is more socially just.
Yeah. John, what about you? I wouldn't want us to wrap up without giving you the opportunity to share.
Well, then you can take us out. To me, it's grassroots. It's people doing little things, and when you over time accumulate those things, it can be power. It can lead to powerful change. I don't have a lot of faith that systematic racism is going to be solved by our current political system.
Yeah.
I think it's going to have to bubble up from grassroots. I'm hopeful that the change in complexion of our country, that we're on a trajectory to have a really diverse population, and that will have an impact. And so it's going to take a lot of patience, however. But I also take hope in, when a couple of years ago, John Meacham came out with a book. He went through some of the most difficult times in our country's history, and we got through them all. Believe it or not, there were more difficult times than what we're going through now, like the Civil War, and we got through them. And so the curve, is, what is it, that phrase from Martin Luther King, the curve of time bends towards justice. It's the curve, but it's up and down and up and down. But if you look at the curve, it goes away. So I'm hopeful based upon our past history, but a lot of just good Americans doing little things over time will have it. And that's where I find my hope.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a really good place for us to wrap things up. I think I want to share, thank you both Russ and Warren for sharing your perspectives, your vulnerability, your transparency, sharing your stories.
Really.
And, this, like the title says, this is a race and we're all still running it. Some of us are jogging, some of us are walking. But I think we're all moving towards what all of you said on this call, to a better place for society and a better America for all. So thank you all out there for listening. For those who are watching us on our YouTube channel, we thank you for that. Please make sure that you subscribe if you like what you hear, and join us for our next episode. So thank you so much. And let's continue these courageous conversations as we, move towards another step towards the race to social justice. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russ.